Franklin Roosevelt wasn't surprised that Japanese forces attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. He expected it, and it's putting it maybe only a little bit too far to say that he welcomed it. Roosevelt was, he was at that time the leading Wilsonian in America, although he did a pretty good job of keeping his Wilsonian credentials under wraps. Roosevelt believed with Woodrow Wilson that the United States needed to play a large role in world affairs. He had learned this almost at Wilson's knee. Roosevelt was a member of Woodrow Wilson's administration in World War I. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And as Assistant Navy Secretary, he was responsible for getting American ships, American warships, American transports ready to take American troops to Europe, American warships to take on German U-boats. He was right in the thick of the war fight. And he watched Wilson as Wilson led the United States into World War I. And Roosevelt agreed with Wilson that the United States needed to play a large and continuing role in world affairs for the good of the world and for the good of the United States. Roosevelt cringed a little bit when Wilson went so far as to say that the United States was going to war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. Roosevelt instinctively understood that high-flying, idealistic statements, they can get you in trouble. They can get you in trouble because you announce this big principle and then you get called upon to apply it in all sorts of places. He also understood that the genius of American politics, if American politics has a genius, is pragmatism. It's not idealism. Americans had shown themselves by this time to be really good at just kind of muddling through, just figuring out how to get from point A to B instead of trying to look all the way down to the end of the road. Roosevelt watched as Woodrow Wilson led the United States into war. He helped accomplish the victory, did his part at the Navy Department. He winced when Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference with ideals just in his starry eyes. Roosevelt recognized this could be a problem, that this President Woodrow Wilson might be riding for a fall. Roosevelt wasn't particularly surprised that the fall came when Wilson brought home the Treaty of Versailles with the League of Nations and failed to get it through the Senate. Roosevelt was a very appealing politician. He was a Democrat, and a lot of people liked him. He was well-spoken, he was good-looking, he was charming, he had all sorts of stuff going for him. In fact, he did so well that he received the Democratic vice presidential nomination in 1920. It was a doomed mission. The American people, after 8 years of the Democrats in the war, they were ready for a change. And so Roosevelt and the number one man on the ticket, James Cox of Ohio, went down to a flaming defeat. But it's in the nature of American politics that vice presidential nominees don't bear the blame if the ticket loses. So Roosevelt came out of the 1920 election looking pretty good. But one of the things he learned from this election was that the American people were not into Wilsonianism, or the idea of a large international role for the United States. So Roosevelt, a canny politician if there ever was one, just shut up about internationalism. He would occasionally give speeches, mouthing platitudes about we have to get along in the world, but he did not push the idea of Wilsonian engagement in the world. He recognized this was a vote loser for a while. He was going to wait until the mood changed. He was pretty sure the mood was going to change because he thought that Wilson was essentially right, that the United States, for its own interests, for its own self-defense, needed to pay attention to the rest of the world. The world was going to come after the United States if the United States did not. This was what had happened in 1917, prompting the American entry into World War I. Roosevelt believed it was going to happen again. He believed it as the ugly head of fascism emerged in Europe and in East Asia in the 1930s. But he still kept his mouth shut. This despite the fact that by this time Roosevelt was president. He was president of the United States, elected in 1932. He decided to focus during his first term, his first 4 years, on domestic affairs. And he had very good reason for doing this. The United States was deep in a depression, and there were lots of problems at home. In his second term, he got reelected in a landslide. So this is when presidents think they can do stuff that might be a little bit unpopular. So he began to think that the United States ought to do more to deal with the rise of these militarists in Germany, Italy, Japan. And he would occasionally give a speech in which he would say we ought to do more, but the reaction to the speeches was underwhelming to say the least, and so Roosevelt backed off. However, the coming of World War II, so World War I ends in 1918, World War II begins in either 1937, if you're looking at Asia. 1937 was when Japan attacked China, or 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. So 1937, 1939, World War II has begun. And Roosevelt is pretty sure that the United States is going to get involved, is going to have to get involved. And he wants to do it on the terms that are most favorable to the United States, but he learned his lesson from Wilson the first time around, and the lesson was, don't go out on any limbs in foreign policy. You cannot go farther than the American people are willing to go. In hindsight, Roosevelt recognized that Wilson's problem was that he had led the United States into World War I. And Roosevelt recognized that in America's democracy, to lead the country is risky stuff. What you really want to do is to educate the country so the country will make its own decisions. Roosevelt watched the politics of the 1930s, and he saw the strength and depth of the isolationists, and he wasn't going to take them on. And he knew as long as the isolationists were around and could make a credible case that the United States ought to stay out of the affairs of the world, then it would be worse than a waste of time to try to get in front of an internationalist movement, because as soon as there was a reverse on the international front, then the isolation would shake their fingers and say, we told you so. And Americans would probably go back to the attitude that they had had in the 1920s and 1930s. So this is something that Roosevelt was very careful about. He did take the opportunity of the war to do something that no president had ever done before, and that was to get elected for a third term. There had been this long-standing, but only de facto, that is unwritten, rule against presidents serving 3 terms. George Washington had established the rule, the precedent, and no president had broken it before. But Roosevelt took the position that with the world in crisis, America needs steady leadership, and American voters agreed with him, and they elected him to a third term. So now Roosevelt is president in a third term, and he begins to nudge the United States in the direction of, first of all, preparedness for war. You can't go to war unless you're ready to go to war. And then to give aid to the countries fighting against the Axis powers. The Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. So give aid to the British, give aid to the French. Well, the French kind of basically dropped out of the war in the spring of 1940 when the Germans invaded and occupied France. And give aid to China fighting against Japan. Give aid to the Soviet Union after the summer of 1941 when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. So Roosevelt is preparing both the American military establishment for war, but he's also preparing the American mind for war, because Roosevelt learned something else from Woodrow Wilson. He learned something from Woodrow Wilson's final lack of success, and that is that as important as war is, it's the peace that comes out of the war that's even more important. Roosevelt believed that Wilson was a decent wartime leader. He led the United States and the American side to victory in relatively short order after the United States got involved. But he hadn't been able to close the deal after the war. And Roosevelt, from even before the United States got involved in the war, was looking to the post-war settlement. And what he wanted was an American commitment, an American emotional commitment, an American political commitment to the Wilsonian vision of continuing American responsibility, American leadership for the state of world affairs. Roosevelt believed that the United States couldn't risk, the world couldn't risk, for the United States to get involved in a second war and then pull back a second time. The world, the United States, simply wouldn't survive. So this is why Roosevelt took so long, even after his third election in 1940, moving the United States toward war. He wanted to make sure that when the United States went to war, the United States was attacked. And so he put economic and diplomatic pressure on Japan. Japan was sort of the easier mark. And Japan was more vulnerable to American pressure, more vulnerable than Germany. So Japan and Germany are the two main belligerents on the Axis side. Italy is important, but not of the same degree of danger to the United States as Germany and Japan. So he puts pressure on Japan, reckoning that the Japanese are going to have to respond. And in fact, he supposed that given their history, given their track record, they would respond by striking out. And Roosevelt fully expected a Japanese attack in the autumn, early winter of 1941. He expected an attack perhaps in the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia, because that part of the world had resources that the Japanese needed, that Roosevelt was depriving the Japanese of when he placed an embargo on oil and on steel that the Japanese needed for their war machine. He thought there might be a chance that the Japanese would attack the Philippines, which remained an American colony. He wouldn't have been surprised if either of those had happened. He was surprised that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This is why surprise attacks work when they work, because they catch the other side by surprise. But as surprised as he was, and as dismayed as he was at the thousands of American deaths in the raid on Pearl Harbor, he breathed a sigh of relief that the United States was now getting into the war. And this is something that he thought was going to happen, and eventually he believed that it must happen, because just like Woodrow Wilson 20-some years before, he knew that if the United States was going to be able to shape the post-war settlement, it needed to be involved in the war itself. You don't get a seat at the peace conference unless you had troops in the field during the war. So, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. The United States is at war with Japan. The United States is shortly at war with Germany and Italy as well when they declare war on the United States, being allies of Japan. So by the end of the second week in December, the United States is in World War II. And in fact, it's at this point that these two separate wars, the war in Europe and the war in Japan, really become World War II. And it's largely because the United States is in the middle of this. The British were also involved in both theaters, but it was really clear that the United States was the big fish in this war. And so the United States now is in a situation where it's potentially fighting a war on two fronts, on opposite sides of the world. And it's fighting with two important allies, and these allies were crucial. One ally was Great Britain, the British Empire. This ally, the British, they were pretty comfortable for Americans to deal with because, after the unpleasantness of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, Americans got pretty used to the idea that the British were as close to America as any other people in the world. And so Americans understood the British. It helped a lot that they share a common language. So Britain is an ally that Americans, and Roosevelt in particular, can warm up to, and Roosevelt can especially warm up to the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill. So Churchill and Roosevelt formed this partnership, a very tight partnership during the war. It became a friendship as well, but it was a friendship that was sometimes marked by a little bit of suspicion and distrust, because Roosevelt understood that although the United States and Britain were allies, they didn't have identical interests. The British were an empire. The British had colonies, a giant colony in India. They had colonies in Africa. The United States was in the process of shedding its major colony, the Philippines. The Philippines were slated for independence in 1946. So Americans had decided to get out of the imperialist game, but the British, they're the biggest empire in the world, maybe perhaps in the history of the world at this point. And they were the ally of the United States. The other important American ally, the third party to the so-called Grand Alliance, was the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was even harder for Americans to warm up to because the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. And its dictator, Joseph Stalin, was a really bad guy. He had killed millions during the 1930s to consolidate his power, and he was as ruthless as could be. The only saving grace of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union, was that they were quite willing to fight Hitler and the Germans. In fact, they were already fighting Hitler and the Germans. In fact, by the time the United States got involved in the war, most of Germany's army was in the Soviet Union, and it was locked up in this titanic struggle with the Soviet Red Army. So these are the allies of the United States. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union. And the partnership, the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. These are the ones who are tasked now with guiding the Allies to victory. They have to come up with some sort of philosophy. So what is their policy going to be? And the one thing that all three of them had in common was this fear of and hatred for Nazi Germany under Hitler. So the one thing they could all agree on was we need to defeat Hitler. And so they declared, they made public, a policy of unconditional surrender toward Germany. Unconditional surrender. There's not going to be any bargaining. Nobody's going to drop out in the middle of this. Nobody's going to cut a deal. No, all three of us are committed to fight until Hitler's regime, the Third Reich, is destroyed. That's it. And we're going to make very sure that the world, Germany, the German people know this time Germany lost, because Hitler came to power in part on this story, this tale, which was false, but nonetheless it was appealing to the German psyche, that Germany had not really lost World War I. It had been betrayed. It had been betrayed by these government officials, many of them Jews, who'd sold out Germany's interests. And in fact, Germany had not been invaded at the end of World War I, and so there wasn't a lot of destruction around Germany to point to say, oh no, we really did lose the war. So it was a beguiling tale that Hitler spun. And Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin wanted to make sure that at the end of this war, Germans not have any doubt that they had been crushed. So unconditional surrender is the first policy that they can agree on. The second policy, and it's related to this, is, well, okay, so of the three countries, the United States and Britain are engaged in a two-front war. So the United States is at war with Germany and Italy and their allies in Europe, and at war with Japan in Asia. So the United States has to choose, where are we going to devote most of our resources? Which of the two theaters, the Pacific, the Asia and the Pacific, or Europe, gets first dibs on American energy, American resources, American troops, and all of this stuff? Britain had the same question because it was involved in both wars. The Soviet Union was not. The Soviet Union was not at war with Japan, and so for the Soviet Union it was all about the war against Germany. And for the Soviet Union it was a matter of life and death. The Germans had invaded far into the Soviet Union, and the Soviet regime was reeling. It had had to retreat and retreat. And it was an open question whether the Soviet Union would survive. So from the Soviet perspective, the reason the Soviet government wanted America as an ally, Britain too, was so that those two countries could put some pressure on Germany and take the pressure off of the Soviet Union. What Stalin wanted more than anything else was a second front against Germany, a second front on the west. There was the Eastern Front within the Soviet Union, and this was the one where the Red Army had everything it could do just to hang on. And so what Stalin hectored Roosevelt and Churchill again and again about was, when are you going to take on Germany? It wasn't a particularly easy thing, because whereas the Soviet Union shared a land corridor with Germany through Poland, there was no way to get directly at Germany. Britain is an island, and to get from Britain to the mainland of Europe, you have to cross the English Channel, and amphibious operations are notoriously difficult and dangerous. So it was going to take a while to build up the forces to make that crossing. The United States, as prepared as it was in dealing in getting ready for World War II, still, if it was going to build up an army that could take on Hitler, it was going to take quite a while. And massing the resources, the strength of the United States, the reason the United States was the linchpin of the Grand Alliance was that American factories could churn out everything it was needed to fight a war, but they couldn't do it all at once. Factories had to convert so automobile factories were switched over to building bombers and military transports. And shipyards had to be converted from peacetime merchant marine ships to wartime transports, warships, and all the other stuff that goes along with this stuff. So it was a big deal getting ready for war. Stalin began to suspect that Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin really did not trust Churchill. He wasn't sure he trusted Roosevelt either, but he really distrusted Churchill. Stalin began to suspect that Roosevelt and Churchill were deliberately going slow about waging war on Germany in hopes that Germany would weaken the Soviet Union. And it was not out of the question that this might be an American policy. In fact, Harry Truman, who was then a senator from Missouri, said shortly after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 that he hoped that the Germans would kill as many Russians as possible and the Russians would kill as many Germans as possible. And so it seemed to be, there seemed to be grounds for this belief that the democracies of the West, the United States and Britain, were trying to bleed the communists of the East dry. And then they would come in and sort of pick up the pieces after the Soviet Union had done most of the fighting. Well, there were certainly people in the United States, like Harry Truman, who thought that would be a good idea. Roosevelt didn't exactly buy into it, but he recognized that there was no strong incentive for the United States to go to war against Germany before the United States was good and ready. Because it would lead to setbacks. A lot of Americans would get killed, and if he had to choose between Americans getting killed and Russians getting killed, he'd rather the Russians got killed. Anyway, the Second Front finally appeared in June of 1944. On D-Day, 1944, American British troops crossed the English Channel, and they took on Germany directly. And over the course of the next 6 months, Americans and the British, and then they were joined by French resistance forces, began pushing the Germans out of France. They approached the border of Germany, and they were sort of closing the ring on Hitler's regime. The other side of the ring, the other closing in, was the Soviet Red Army, which had turned the tide in Russia and was now pushing west into Germany. So Hitler's regime was caught in this vice between the Americans, the British, and the French moving in from the west, and the Soviets moving in from the east. This gets us up to the beginning of 1945. Roosevelt has been elected for a fourth term. He broke the precedent in getting elected a third term. He figured, well, might as well stick around for a fourth term. The war was still going on. It was known that Roosevelt was not well, but it wasn't known how not well he was. He was a sick man. He had very high blood pressure, and he was a candidate to have a stroke and die at any time. He managed to hold things together through a meeting at the Russian resort city of Yalta in February of 1945. And Roosevelt and Churchill flew to Yalta to meet with Stalin. And they came to agreement on how the end game of the war should take place. So they talked about the future of Germany. They didn't come to any definitive decision on the future of Germany. They talked about the future of Poland. Poland was a hot topic for the United States, for Britain, and for the Soviet Union. Poland was where the war in Europe had begun with the German invasion. And it was the German invasion of Poland that triggered Britain's declaration of war against Germany. The United States had an interest in Poland because there were a whole lot of Polish Americans. The Soviets had a big interest in Poland because historically Poland had been the corridor through which Russia and the Soviet Union had been invaded by Western forces. So they talked a lot about Poland, and the United States and Britain wanted Stalin to promise that Poland would have a democratic government, an elected government. This was something that was really important for them because they were fighting for democracy, they were fighting for freedom. It was really important for Stalin that Poland should have a government friendly to the Soviet Union. Now, what this meant in practice was a government subservient to the Soviet Union, because Stalin was not going to stand for another invasion from the West. So Poland was going to be something of a buffer for the Soviet Union after this war. So the three came to an agreement, at least on paper. Poland would have a democratic government friendly to the Soviet Union. Now, no one who knew anything about the history of Russian-Polish relations had any difficulty seeing through that disguise, because a democratic government of Poland, one elected by the Polish people, would not be friendly to the Russians. The Poles hated the Russians. But on paper it looked okay, and that was something they were willing to get along with. Now later this would be basis for criticism of Roosevelt. Didn't Roosevelt see what he was doing? Didn't he know that Stalin would never live up to his promise? And the answer was, yeah, he knew that Stalin, at the very least, would have to have his feet held to the fire to hold on to that promise. But it's not as though Roosevelt could dictate terms at Yalta, because Stalin had something that Roosevelt needed, or at least thought he needed, and that was Soviet troops in the war against Japan. The war against Germany was almost over, and the handwriting was on the wall for Hitler. But it looked like there could be a long slog before the end of the war against Japan. And what Roosevelt wanted was a promise from Stalin that the Soviet Union would enter the war finally against Japan. That way, the Japanese would be fighting a war on two fronts. They'd have to deal with Soviet troops to their west, and then American troops and American ships coming in from Japan's east. And he got that promise. So Roosevelt came away from Yalta thinking he'd done a pretty good job. He had gotten the Soviet promise to enter the war against Japan, and this could save tens of thousands, conceivably hundreds of thousands of American lives. This was a huge deal. Not long after returning from Yalta, Roosevelt dropped dead. People on the inside had been expecting that something like this might happen. People on the outside didn't know. And Americans were shocked. The world was shocked that Roosevelt, on the verge of victory against Germany, had died suddenly. And the new president was this fellow that few people knew anything about, Harry Truman. Harry Truman had not trained to be an international leader. He had not trained to be an internationalist, a Wilsonian. He had come up through the ranks of Missouri politics, which were kind of sordid. He became a decent senator, but he was on the ticket because there was a revolt against the sitting Vice President Henry Wallace. Among those people who thought, Roosevelt might die, and then we're going to be saddled with this Henry Wallace character as president. So Roosevelt chose Harry Truman primarily because he was uncontroversial. But he was also very unversed in foreign policy. All of a sudden, Harry Truman is President of the United States. The momentum of events in Europe guided American, British, and Soviet forces to victory over Germany in early May 1945. VE, Victory in Europe Day, occurs in early May 1945. That part of the war is over. The war against Japan still going on. It looked like it might go on for a long time until the United States tested an atom bomb in the summer of 1945. Now, when Roosevelt made his deal with Stalin at Yalta, he did not know that the Manhattan Project, the project that produced the atom bomb, was going to succeed. It hadn't finished its testing, its design. It hadn't done anything to guarantee that this bomb was actually going to happen. And so he needed Soviet help. He thought he did. The bomb comes along, and now maybe the United States does not need Soviet help. Maybe, but nobody could count on it. Truman has to decide, do I use the bomb? Later, Truman would be criticized for using the bomb. He should have tried something else. In fact, at the time, it was almost inconceivable that Truman would not use the bomb. He warned the Japanese against their utter destruction, and he said they must surrender at once. When they didn't, he ordered a bomb dropped against Hiroshima, then another bomb dropped against Nagasaki. At that point, Japan surrendered. The war is over. And what's going to happen after the war? What's going to become of the Grand Alliance? Well, the world would have to wait and see.